to Joe Orsini.
Good morning, everyone. 10 years of screening, and I feel privileged and honored to have been a part of it from the beginning, and certainly have been enjoying the ride, I guess, and being able to help people with screening through the years. So this is the 8th meeting, so we've been at this for a while, and every year the number of states have been growing, although our meeting yesterday, which was what I'm summarizing today, was a group of maybe 14 or 15 states, so it's a little down from the previous years, and I think people are getting comfortable with screening that have been at it for a while, so, but the new states are coming to these meetings, and I think that's been helpful. So the meeting that we have the day before this is the roundtable, and I think the main purposes have been to at least harmonize our thinking with newborn screening and to really study the cases. So now that we're at 10 years, studying the cases is becoming more of an availability, and that's going to be what I'll be covering a bit on this. So it's been 8 years since the approval, and went from I think 3 or 4 states at that time when it was fully approved to now what Lisa said of 42 states. So this is just a disclaimer because I'm not supposed to give presentations without approval. This is a summary of yesterday's meeting discussions. These are the 16 participants. For most of these states, we're able to provide data, but not all of the states, but these are the states that were involved. So one of the points that's worth making is now we have, after this long of screening in New York, we've actually have cases we could discuss. And so I opened up the discussion with providing data on what we've seen in New York State as far as cases. So we had states that all the states provided their screening statistics and follow-up, any screening and follow-up issues. And we'll talk a little more about those as we get through the talk. I provided a case review, as I mentioned, and I'm going to go over some of those cases just to give an idea of what we've been detecting. And then some discussions ensued of gene variant classifications, which is what happens when you start looking at cases and you're looking at what we were looking at are some of the variants of unknown significance, and what's that mean, and when does it become a pathogenic variant? And it's sort of different than the way ACMG guidelines present it and the thinking. And we like to think once somebody with severe disease has disease, that becomes a really suspect variant. And when does it go from likely pathogenic to really pathogenic? In the ACMG guidelines, it's kind of stricter, but in the medical community, I think it can make that jump fairly quick. We had also discussed some of this stress dose. One of the things that we found in New York is there are babies that have been found to have abnormal adrenal function testing when they're really young, and those babies get put on stress dose. And to be honest, I'm not really sure exactly what that means, but I know what it means from the point of view of our endocrinologists is that that baby doesn't necessarily have disease yet, but they're equipped with the medications needed should there be a crisis that they need to deal with. And we talked a lot about the ALD variant database that Dr. Stefan Kemp has been updating since 1999. And for anybody here who hasn't seen it, if you're into newborn screening and you've got variants, that's the go-to place for getting a summary, as well as going to the literature yourself. But that's a fairly up-to-date database that's going to show a lot of data that will help you with evaluating these variants. And we showed some firsthand how helpful it could be in the meeting yesterday. The other thing that happens a lot and a lot of states have issues with is first tier, the flow injection when you're doing first tier testing. And mostly this is a larger state issue where they're screening using flow injection instead of HPLC. And that gives rise to a lot of false positives. And you end up having to go to a second tier test which uses LC and eliminates the problem that's from an unknown compound that's interferes with the testing. So going into this a little bit, this is the New York assay, and each state, when we were presenting the data, gave an overview of what assay they were doing, how they were doing it, and then what kind of numbers they're getting as far as boys, girls that were positive in other disorders. But what I was telling you earlier, flow injection, tandem mass spec, there's an unknown interferent that gives a fairly large signal in screening for ALD. And if you put that same solution onto a column, it'll separate the isobar, this unknown interferent, from the compound we look for, which is C26. LPC is a very long chain fatty acid with a lysophosphatidylcholine head on it. And then, so we do the first tier, second tier, and then New York is, we're fortunate to be able to do ABCD1 variant testing in our screening lab, which allows us to get a variant in when we're reporting to the physician, or we can see if there's no variant or variant, so we can kind of give them an idea of whether it's an ALD, possible ALD case, or some other peroxisomal storage disorder, or some other disorder that's unrelated but has elevated marker. So this is a flashback, which I like to go back to because it reminds people of kind of the numbers. New York State's population average through first tier is 0.21, but what's interesting is when we ran positives in our archives, we evolved the ALD in some Zellweger cases, and you can see these concentrations. And this is C26 LPC in micromole per liter. With first tier, 0.78 is our lowest number. When we go to second tier, the lowest number was 0.7. So all of our real ALD cases from archive samples were 0.7 or above. And these are newborn screen samples. We also were provided, this is at the beginning of screening, we were trying to set it up about 11 years ago now. And I remember this like it was just yesterday because it was a pretty painful process going through this. But we had some other controls that were sent to us. And this is by Mayo. They shared positives. Mayo is the one that actually started this, turned the test into kind of a high throughput test where you could do it with lysosomal storage disorders. So when New York first got started, we did both things, lysosomal and ALD at the same time. Well, we measured this one baby at 0.48 micromole per liter, and that set us our first tier cutoff at 0.4 and kind of put us on the road to screening. And of course, other states came on, and everybody tries to follow what other, maybe the first state's doing, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent. And we, when you're new at it, you do what you can to make sure you don't miss any cases. So this is what we did. I'm just going to briefly go over this. The mentality is, if you have greater than 0.4, you automatically go to, on a first tier test, you automatically go to a second tier LC. And if that's a greater than 0.4, then we go to the molecular testing to do ABCD1 variant testing. But that's just for information purposes. Anything that's above 0.4 is automatically a screen positive and will be referred out. Just for example, when we have really elevated LPC values at this point, if the baby's in NICU or we see the numbers are so high that we're concerned, we'll make the call out before we even have ABCD1 variant testing done. More often than not, it's a baby in the NICU with a likely Zellweger case. So those we pick up fairly regularly. In fact, we had one this week, and it turned out that it was a sibling of one we had earlier. So it's kind of like a proficiency test sample that we detected. But I want to point to this borderline case, and this is where the numbers are on the lower side of positive. And when we get a borderline, we actually will call for a repeat. If the repeat's borderline again, then it goes through and molecular testing and we'll refer if the baby, no matter what at that point. If the repeat was less than 0.24, it's screen negative. If the beginning is less than 0.4, it's screen negative. So that's our algorithm. The reason I bring this up is these borderlines, which is where we're not really sure what they mean. And those are the numbers where you're picking up, and we still pick up babies in that range that have ABCD1 variants, but we're not always certain what they mean. So I talked about this already. So these are the case reviews. What I like to point out, if you see the reds, these are children that have either developed cerebral ALD or had older siblings that when we detected them had cerebral ALD. Look at the concentrations you see for first tier 1.3, second tier 1.14. Very elevated, very similar to what I showed on one of the early slides where we had gone back to archived specimens. This is true with this particular baby, 1.1 and 0.94. This child is more in a borderline range, but they're considered to apparently have had abnormal adrenals testing. And this baby was found with a likely pathogenic variant. But all of the babies we've seen with cerebral ALD, a large number of them, when you go to Dr. Kemp's database, the ABCD1 variant database, they're found to be pathogenic and identified in already known cases. This is fairly common, although New York has identified babies with a variant baby that has those variants, and they did go on to develop disease. So a VUS does not mean don't worry about it. It means worry about it until proven otherwise. And one of the reasons for this meeting and every meeting that the group that gets together on a kind of regular basis, we try to go once a quarter, but it's probably a little less than that, where we try to discuss these kind of cases, and I'm hoping that this will show an example of how this group works. So these are some of the babies. They're symptomatic, and I have it in italicized because not all of them are really symptomatic, but it's babies that we've got information back on. And for example, these stress dose ALD cases, and I emphasize stress dose adrenal ALD does not equal an ALD diagnosis. It just means that we're watching that baby. They have potential adrenal insufficiency, and they're on the stress dose. And that's not really on it. They're equipped with a stress dose in case the child goes into a crisis. And you can see these numbers are a little more borderline, but they're not completely borderline. And I want to point that out. Here's a child with an older brother who had cerebral disease and very elevated. This one's sort of a little bit of a question because it's so elevated that some of us wonder if it's a possible Zellweger case, because that's in the range of Zellweger cases. More CLAD where the numbers are in the 1 range, which is similar to what we saw in the beginning. Similar with all of these cerebral ALD cases. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just showing for examples. Now we get into these borderline cases. And what I like to point out is for states that are either on the call or in the meetings that we've had, is when we have borderline cases, and for us that means somebody that's 0.4 or under by second tier testing. So look at these second tier numbers. They're in between 0.24 and 0.4. When we pick up these babies, we see this a lot. When we get a variant. Here's an arginine 163 to histidine, and it's in the ABCD1 variant database, a VUS reported 6 times in ALD newborn screening, but not been associated with disease. Okay, so since 1999, this database has been, Stefan's worked tirelessly to keep it up to date with any reported variants and anybody associated with disease. So these variants that are showing up just through newborn screening and borderline numbers, well, we see this fairly often. Another example, VUS 4 times, another one 14 times, another VUS 4 times, none of them associated with disease. So the summary of all the data is boys with cerebral ALD have very elevated LPC, 26 LPC, first tier range from 0.94 to 196, and a second tier 0.75 to 1.5. Those numbers should sound familiar. It's what we saw in our original cutoff studies with 0.78 to 175 for first tier and second tier 0.79 to 1.66. These are for the ALD cases. There was an ALD carrier or a female with ALD that was at 0.7, so that was our lowest number. One thing I want to point out here is the New York's median 0.08, and this is for labs to get a better feel for what these numbers actually mean relative to New York's number. If you use a multiple of median, this is greater than 9. So this 0.75 divided by 0.08 is a number 9 times higher than the median. So to give you an idea of where you might stand. When we go into the borderline cases, and those are the 0.24 to 0.39, I'm not going to go through all these slides, but that range where we're picking up the variants of unknown significance are actually they're in the borderline between the bottom end, but 3 to almost 5 is what the multiple of median is for that group. So, people anywhere between 4.88 and 9, that's kind of, I want to call that more of the gray zone. Not that this area here isn't still considered the gray zone. I think we still all consider, in newborn screening, consider this the gray zone as well, because there's just not enough cases or enough time has gone by to be certain. But we watch all these babies. But the gray zone is probably higher than our borderline zone, the real gray zone. But that's what this group meets on to try to determine. So that's the moderate range group I was telling you about. This is the area where we see more of adrenal insufficiency and stress dosing reported, or families members with subsequently diagnosed with ALD, and I'm unsure if any of these have symptoms. So one of the things that has been very helpful and people talk about with ALD screening is what's the family history? Is there a family history? And can you go back to older, especially males in the family, look for variants, the same variant that you're picking up in the baby, and if that older male is healthy, then it gives you some feeling about, or some understanding about what that variant might mean. But it is only one data point, so we still always have to be concerned. So I've gone over this enough. Go to the next page. So normally what we do is, in this meeting, is each state provides their number of babies screened, number of boys, and number of girls. We didn't have those numbers quite readily available, and Elisa's tallied those, and the states that were involved are going to get a table of those. So this is just a summary from the 2023 meeting. There have been incidents for males as high as 1 in 4,000 and as low as 168,000. Females 1 in almost 4,000 to 1 in 75,000, and overall 1 in 5,000 as a high incidence to 1 in 26,000 for a low incidence. This is from last year's meeting. And as I said, more states now are detecting patients that have developed symptoms, and those are what we're really interested in studying, because they give us the information about how we can get feedback with newborn screen results. And Lisa will be sending a tally of these to the states that were participating from yesterday's meeting. Some other diseases that are picked up besides the ALD male and females, you see Aicardi-Goutieres syndrome cases, and a few of those were picked up this past year or in other states. New York was the first to identify such a case, and it was a surprise for us. And so it's something that people are monitoring now that they are aware of this and have we've picked up other cases. And Zellweger is pretty much the primary other disorder that's picked up through newborn screening for ALD. So one of the things, this is a reminder to any of the states, we did talk about this at the end of the meeting, and it was the spreadsheet where we review state data for especially what the population data is showing, as well as any symptomatic children. And we're trying to keep a tally on all those, and that's one of the beauties of the group, is collaborating to try to put all of our heads together and have a better understanding. Where is this gray zone, and how can we make it smaller and shrink it to where we're really just detecting those babies that have disease? So that's a summary of yesterday. I want to thank Lisa for having these meetings, and especially the consortium meetings, and the work they're doing to try to keep all of our states moving forward in what would I call what's the ALD mindset that Stefan talked about yesterday, of very collaborative efforts throughout the community. And I think that's what makes it really rewarding. So thank you very much.
So, Joe, the question was about the thresholds at different states and the techniques at different states. So, you're using C26 LISO PC. Of the states that are screening, how many states are using that? And then does the cutoff vary from state to state? And is that a determinant of who's getting the higher incidence rates and lower incidence rates, or is it more complicated than that?
No, I think it's pretty. It's a little maybe a little more complicated. So one of the I did want to mention this. One of the things that we were able to do. The CDC provides controls. Everybody's using LPC to screen. Um, the the second tier method, the LC methods, are very similar, and what gives rise, I believe, to the differences between one state and another state is more than likely just the actual internal standard, maybe a purity, where they've obtained that material from. Because all of these, whenever we determine a concentration, is based on a ratio of signal measured in the blood of the LPC compound, target compound, ratioed against an internal standard. And there's some differences in mass specs that might, give you slight different ratios. And people in a lab where you're doing multiple instruments, you try to make all the instruments read the same. So one of the things that we've been doing in New York, and we try to do with other states, is if they're uncertain, and I'm not saying we have the most perfect system or cutoffs or anything like that, but if you want to know where you sit relative to New York, we'll do sample exchanges, and we include CDC controls as well as some positives, and we do a range of LPC concentrations that we've measured in the New York population. Then we just do an XY scatter plot, get a slope, and basically measure the bias of their lab relative to our lab. And we've been, since the beginning, we try to match our CDC controls that we run every day to keep them in line with where we started, which isn't easy, but that's what we try to do. And that allows everybody else to kind of gauge themselves benchmark themselves against what we're doing. Right, wrong, or indifferent. But, the more of us, and that's sort of the harmonization side of things that we try to do, and it's one way to do it. It's probably, I think, the only way to do it. But some states have they've made their own internal standard, and they end up with a different median. So the median is a good gauge of where you might sit. Like if somebody has a median of 0.04 and we're 0.08, if everything else is equal and it's a linear kind of process, their cutoff should be about half of ours to be equivalent. So if somebody's lower than us or higher than us relative to their median, then that opens up how many cases you're going to pick up, more than likely. But there's also a population effect that like in Minnesota, they have a really high incidence rate. There was a group of people that seem to have a certain variant, and it might be in this range of will they become symptomatic or not. And I think that's where the time will tell, and all of us working together is going to get the answer. And it's probably another 10 years, I feel like 10 years out. That's my 5, just so we get the numbers and we can really start to say, these variants we're picking up, these are the ranges, and they're in line with all these other variants that are they've never been detected, never seen a symptomatic patient. So the longer we work and work together, the sooner that number is going to get clear. And that's the way I think we're going to end up doing it.
And I would just add, maybe I'll speak from some of the things I'm hearing from the families here, is the big interest from those who screen in is not, are they going to be positive one day? It's how do we know that we don't need to screen them anymore? Like when can we rule them out? And that's actually a harder one, because there are, I think I counted, and I think it's like 17 or 27 MRIs, or a very large number of studies in the first 18 years of life. And so I think the MRIs in particular are quite psychologically and logistically and financially burdensome for families. So I think this is on the minds of the screeners too, but I think it's actually figuring out who is low risk or not risk that
Right.
is of greatest interest to the families.
There was a discussion that came up yesterday as well as with a geneticist that, when you're in that range where you're really not certain or the risk seems very low, should you be following that baby? And when we first got started, we didn't know. And we kind of opened up I don't want to call it a floodgate because it wasn't a super huge number, but any family that's in that, it's very impactful. And believe me, I'm very sensitive to that. Maybe overly worried about it coming from the back, having observed it through other screening processes. So, the trouble is that a lot of those lower level ones have elevated very long chain fatty acids and a variant. And those elevated values have been done at labs throughout the country where there's not really an ALD expert necessarily running the test or who set up the test. It's just a test that's part of diagnostics. So early stages, we noticed there were a lot of cases where they didn't even have what a very long chain fatty acid reference range was for a newborn. And I'm not saying I don't know if there's a difference, but LPCs, there's definitely a difference. So it's confused or compounded the problem. And, I feel like there's some that we're picking up that are truly false positives, but that we can't be certain. And that's why this project's been going on so long and why we're so focused on it.
Thanks.
Do you know how many other states include sequencing?
I don't know. There are a fair number. Maybe Amy. Do you have any idea, Amy?
A lot have chosen not to do it. Yeah, there are quite a few who have chosen not to do it and refer that to the clinical team. But
Yeah.
a handful, maybe,
Yeah.
of states do it themselves.
Yeah, and that adds a little bit. I mean, that's where some of our numbers, like when we're doing, in a timely manner. And the other thing that is a big cautionary statement is if you get a report from a laboratory that's done the ABCD1 variant testing, they say it's pathogenic. It's not necessarily pathogenic. You need to do your own looking up at this point because each lab is interpreting differently. So, especially if it's a low end range. Yes, Bob.
Just one comment on that. I mean, there are two boxes. One is newborn screening, and then there's the diagnostic section, which is not a screening test, but is a diagnostic center. And that's really where the problem ends up. So I don't think there's a diagnostic center in the country today who has any question of whether it's ALD or not, who would not go on to. In other words, the variants of unknown significance, where we're not sure, or there's very little risk of disease, we would still go on to WES. We'd still sort of sequence it at the diagnostic. The problem is that information doesn't get back to the lab all the time. So different states have different systems. And to go back to this question before, it's up to the diagnostic centers to decide at what point is it reasonable to say that the burden of surveillance is reasonable here, or the risk is so low that the burden is greater than warranted. Again, that remains in a different box than the screening, and that's really hard often to communicate back and forth. We don't have a really set system, and no state, I don't know, 2 states has the exact same system.
Any other questions? Thanks very much for your attention.